My dear brothers and sisters in Islam, as many of you know, I had the privilege of living in the city of the Prophet ﷺ for about 8 years. The city of Medina. I was there as a student. And typically, we would, of course, stay the duration of the school year, which is much like our school year here, from September until May, June. And then we would go home during the summer vacation. And in that region of the world, the winter and spring months, maybe even a little bit of the fall, is quite mild. For the desert, that is. It's the summer season that's extremely hot. And most of those 8 years, I was back here in the United States enjoying what many thought was extreme heat, but in comparison to what I left, it's quite pleasant. Could you imagine 95, 96, 98, even the 99-degree days that we have here going, this is great weather in comparison to what I was just in. I can remember in anticipation for those summers when I would leave, closing down our apartment. We would draw all the shutters closed and the shades. We would even put cardboard in the windows to kind of seal them up to prevent dust from coming in, and also the heat of the sun. We would cover all the AC units and try and keep as much direct sunlight out of the apartment as possible. And I remember coming back at the end of one of the breaks. Of course, all was well inside of the home, except that I found these candles that we bought the previous, school year. You know those big decorative candles that you buy at Yankee Candle or IKEA or whatever? They're quite large, 5-6 inches in diameter. Typically, they just are for decoration. When I came in, I found that all of those candles, and there were a handful of them, had melted. No fire. They weren't burned. They were melted down, no longer usable. We had to actually scrape them, clean them up, and discard them. So I started thinking to myself, how hot must it have been, even with the windows closed and the shades drawn and cardboard in there? So I looked up, when does wax start melting? And it starts melting around 115 degrees Fahrenheit. It starts to soften up. And that means without the AC on during the summer, the house was about 115 degrees. I can't imagine how uncomfortable that would be to live in on a regular basis. I mean, we're so sensitive now to climate control that even here at times, if the temperature rises to 74, 75, and it has in the past, or higher, 76, 77, we start to sweat, we get uncomfortable, and we begin filing complaints. What's wrong with the AC? Is it broken? Is something wrong? Did we not pay the bill? What's going on? So, returning back to that type of a heat, even when we turned the AC on, full blast, all of the AC units working, the coolest we could get the house was 78 degrees during the day and 75 during the night. And that's because that part of the world, during the hottest months, they reach between 125 degrees in the shade to 145 degrees in the sun. That's record-breaking temperatures. And that was recorded just last year. You imagine 145 degrees in the baking sun? Many of you may be thinking, that can't be possible. Well, here in the United States, they get those types of temperatures into the 130s in California, out in the desert. And what makes matters worse is when you start talking about thermal mass. Thermal mass and heat absorption. Thermal mass like rocks, dry brick, the desert floor, which is very dry. And it begins to soak up that heat. And believe it or not, there's about a 25-degree discrepancy between the temperature in the air and that thermal mass, meaning that the earth can heat up 25 degrees or 30 degrees higher than the actual temperature. That's potentially 170 degrees Fahrenheit on the ground. 170 degrees on the ground. And so I remember one time while in school, as a joke, my friends and I met up after class and we actually fried an egg outside in the university parking lot on one of the rocks, just to see what happened. You know, we have that saying, it's so hot outside you can fry an egg. And so as Americans, you know, we're always doing these silly things. And we did that outside in the parking lot. We watched the egg cook right there in front of us. That was a joke. But you know what's not a joke is if you step on that without shoes. If you go outside without your shoes on. So what does that look like for your bare feet when you walk out to such temperatures, 170 degrees, perhaps on the ground or the rock? The minimum temperature that can cause skin to burn in a finite amount of time is 111 degrees if the exposure time exceeds 6 hours. If your skin is exposed to 111 degrees over a 6-hour period, it will burn. From 111 to 124 degrees Fahrenheit, the rate of burn approximately doubles with each degree that you increase. So the burn would develop in less than a second if the exposure temperature is at least 160 degrees Fahrenheit. That means that 170, potentially 170 degree surface, that just for a second, if you were exposed directly to that without anything protecting the skin, it would burn. Now, what degree burn, of course, we would have to perhaps go outside and test that. Forget about your foot. Imagine having to lay out on such a hot surface. It's not like going to the Jersey Shore to get tanned by the sun. You're talking about pain and discomfort. And this is exactly what the idolaters of Mecca would do to some of the Muslims during the life of the Prophet ﷺ. And they would do this in order to make them renounce their newfound faith and to deny the Prophet ﷺ. Now, these idolaters, they used all types of tactics. They used everything that they could. And each clan of the Quraysh, they dealt with their own Muslims in their clan in various different ways. But this particular tactic of using the sun and the heat and hot surfaces to burn was well known and employed by the infamous Umayyah ibn Khalaf, who was one of the great, we could say, leaders of his clan from Banu Jum'ah, but he was also an enemy to the Muslims. Umayyah had an African slave. His name was Bilal ibn Rabah. Many of you have heard of his name before. Famous Muslim. His parents were of Abyssinian origin. His father, Rabah, was subjugated by this clan, the clan of Umayyah, and it was said that his mother, Hamama, she was once an Abyssinian princess who was subjugated during the time of the elephant. You remember that story. She came over with that army and was captured and subjugated by the Quraysh. Bilal was one of the first to accept Islam. He accepted Islam through the efforts of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu. And he was of the first 7 to publicize the fact that he was Muslim. Among them was the Prophet ﷺ. He was protected by his uncle, the Prophet ﷺ. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq proclaimed his Islam publicly. He was protected by his clan. But then there were others like Ammar and his mother, like Bilal, Al-Miqdad. They had no tribal protection, and so they were the subject of torment and torture. And so when Umayyah found out Bilal had accepted Islam, he began to torture him in hopes that he would reject it. And he did many different things. He did many different things to Bilal. It wasn't just, as many of us know, that he was put out on that desert floor and expected to turn away, but he was beaten. He was drugged through the city. Umayyah would jump on his stomach, and nothing was working. Bilal was just too strong. He was physically strong, but he was strong of faith. And so the next thing that was done, as you know, is he was taken out into an open area where there was no obstruction of the sun. There was no shade, and he was made to lie on that desert floor. You can imagine the temperatures above the 100s, 120, 30, 40, ila masha'Allah. And he was tied down with stakes driven into the ground, and his hands and legs were spread out, and he was tied onto that surface. And then boulders were pressed upon his stomach and his chest. So now you have heat from the ground, but you also have this thermal mass from those boulders. So it's not just you're burning on your back, and it's not just the weight that's pushing you down onto the stovetop, but it's also this hot boulder that's sitting on your front. And Umayyah was there commanding that he return back to Al-Lat and Uzza, the idols of the Quraysh. And what was Bilal doing? He was saying, Rabbi Allah, Al-Ahad, Al-Ahad. My Lord is Allah, the one, the one. And he kept repeating this over and over again. And he would not give in. Many gave in. Many of the Muslims that had no protection, because they were tortured to such extents, they had to endure such physical harm that eventually they broke. And they gave in. Even though they said what they said to avoid punishment, they didn't believe in those false gods. They were just trying to escape being humiliated and harmed. But Bilal, he would not. And eventually, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq got word of what was happening. And he headed out. And he began to rebuke Umayyah for the treatment of Bilal. And of course, Umayyah blamed Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. He said, it's your fault that this is happening to him, because you're the one that changed his religion. And so Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, he wanted to make things right, of course, and this was his way, the great Abu Bakr. And so he began to barter with Umayyah until eventually he struck a deal to free Bilal. He was able to free Bilal, and he had freed a number of slaves that accepted Islam to let them go live in peace. Amr ibn Fuhayra was one of them, was also one of the slaves that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he bought and he freed. Amr ibn Fuhayra would become the shepherd of Abu Bakr, who would later play a crucial role in the hijrah. And hopefully we'll talk about that someday. So these other Muslims that they kind of had to give in to save themselves, they're excused from that. Our tradition recognizes the very natural struggle of self-preservation. And so, while under duress, you're not held accountable for many things. While under duress, the words that you utter, words of disbelief, you're not held accountable. So they would have been excused. But what about Bilal? If he could have been excused and just saved himself the torment, why did he stand strong? And the other companions of his caliber, why did they stand strong with such resolve? What would make you stand strong to that degree? Think about that for a minute or for a second, and I'll be right back. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين من كل ذنب فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله والحمد لله حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه كما يحب ربنا ويرضاه ونصلي ونسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله. What would you be willing to do to get off the desert floor? The desert floor that's 150 degrees or more. How far would you go or be willing to go to avoid a slow burn of 140, 150 degrees? Remember, skin starts to burn at 111 with exposure of 6 hours or more. What would you be willing to give to avoid destruction of life and property by fire? What does that mean to you? I hate to do this, always comparing things to dollars, always measuring things in money, but it just seems like such an easy measurement that most of us can understand very well. What does fire safety mean? It was reported that the global fire safety equipment, just equipment, we're not talking about personnel or infrastructure, we're talking about equipment, was estimated at $58 billion in 2018. That's how much money we spent on fire safety equipment around the world. $58 billion, which is expected to expand at a compound annual growth rate of 8.8% between 2019 and 2025. It's going to continue to go up. That's how valuable fire safety, just the equipment, you know, the fire extinguishers and the fire alarms, etc. That's how valuable it is to us. We understand the destruction that fire can cause. Taking reasonable precautions to avoid such outcomes is not only rational, but it's smart. Think about the fire alarms. Even here, there's fire alarms. There's a sprinkler system. There are extinguishers in various locations. Maybe you don't notice them, but they're there. In case there is a fire, you can see an extinguisher right over there by the escape door. There's an emergency exits. They're lit. There's equipment safety mechanisms. There's electrical code that we have to follow to prevent fires. There's various different appliances that you're permitted to put in your home or in a place of business. You have to pass codes. You know, these fire safety regulations and codes and devices, they're just commonplace, so much so that many of us don't think about them anymore. We've just come to expect them. We've come to expect that those safety measures are present and available. It's like, who's not doing that? Who's not following fire safety? I mean, who's not taught fire safety as a small child? That's the type of question. It's not some strange thing. It's not some newfound information. Fire safety goes back to the very beginning, when the first person got burned. He said, oh, we better be careful with that. It's hot. You know, here in Camden County, we have 65 fire stations. And a part of the job of those stations is to go and inspect buildings, like this very building. We had the fire inspector come out 2 weeks ago and check out the building, and that fire inspector reminds us about fire safety and our code and where we are. Imagine if there was a fire. Imagine if there was a fire. Ma'adallah. May Allah protect us and save us from such a test and a trial. What if we came to find out that those fire safety standards weren't being followed? Somebody's house caught fire, and then the news reporter said, well, they didn't have a fire extinguisher, they didn't have a smoke detector, they didn't have proper wiring, they didn't. There would be this little voice in our head going, well, you're not following the safety standards, and that's what happens. There would be this little voice, even if it was faint. It would be like, you know, it's not really disappointed more than it is blameworthy. That's what happens when you don't take precautions. So Think about that, because you may have thought of that before. When you see negligence, you go, well, that's what you get for being negligent. You lost something because you weren't taking the proper measures. With that line of thinking, I want to draw your attention to a similar scenario that we will all face when there is immense heat below us. And that's what is known as a sirat. The sirat is what is known as a bridge, the bridge which extends over the hellfire. Now, the hellfire is very different than the fire of this world. The Prophet ﷺ said that the hellfire, or I should say the fire of the hottest flame of this world, is juz'un min sab'ina juz'a. It's 1 part of 70, meaning the hottest flame of this world is 1 part of 70 times what the heat looks like in the hellfire. And there is that bridge which extends over the fire and serves as a crossing to paradise. It's slippery and unstable. Foot would not make it. And those feet are only fixed by the blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is described as being sharper than a sword, narrower than a strand of hair, hotter than a coal, and has hooks that grasp at the feet. And traversing the bridge, going across that, is in accordance with our deeds. How fast we will go across is in accordance to our deeds. So there will be people that will walk across, there will be people that will ride across, and there will be people that will crawl on their bellies across that bridge. One of the great Imams, Imam al-Qurtubi rahimahullah, narrated a tradition that indicated everyone will be stopped along the way, crossing the bridge at various archways. Everyone will be stopped along the way at various archways to be asked a number of questions. So this tradition goes that at the first archway, you will be asked about your faith in Allah, al-imanu billah. And what's meant by this is the shahada. You will be asked about the shahada, which the true, sincere shahada is statement and action. And if you were able to produce it sincerely, then you will pass. If you're not, you may slip and you may fall into that pit of fire. And at the second archway, you will be asked about prayer, salah. And if you were able to produce all of your prayers that you were obliged to make while you were living here in this world, then you will pass that archway onto the next. The next, you will be asked about fasting Ramadan, and how many Ramadans that you spent. And if you're able to produce all of those fasts, then you will pass by that archway to the next. The fourth, you will be asked about zakat. And if you paid all of your zakat during your life, then you will pass on to the fifth. And the fifth archway, you will be asked about Hajj and Umrah. And if you performed Hajj and Umrah, of course, having had the ability to do so, meaning you were obliged, and you were able to do that, both Hajj and Umrah, then you will pass on to the sixth, where you will be asked about wudu and ghusl, about purification, spiritual purification. And if you were able to produce, meaning you did as you should have done, then you will pass on to the next. This is what fire safety in the hereafter looks like. We could call this hellfire safety standards, if you will. And it's not alarms, it's not fire extinguishers, it's not mechanisms, but it's al-imanu billah. It's prayer, it's fasting, it's zakat, it's hajj, it's umrah, it's purification. And just like the fire of this world, you don't go getting your fire safety equipment when things are ablaze. When the house is going up in smoke, you don't run out to buy the fire extinguisher. You don't go trying to put the batteries in the fire alarm while the fire is burning. It's simply too late. You should have already had those tools in place. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us in the Quran. He says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا قُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَأَهْلِيكُمْ نَارًا وَقُودُهَا النَّاسُ وَالْحِجَارَةُ عَلَيْهَا مَلَائِكَةٌ غِلَاظٌ شِدَادٌ لَا يَعْصُونَ اللَّهَ مَا أَمَرَهُمْ وَيَفْعَلُونَ مَا يُؤْمَرُونَ. O you who have believed, protect yourselves and your families from a fire whose fuel is men and stones, over which are appointed angels, harsh and severe. They do not disobey Allah in what He commands them, but they do as they have been ordered. Think about it for a minute. Think about this. Faith in Allah, prayer, zakat, fasting, hajj, umrah, purification. What do these represent? These are the pillars, the fundamentals of your faith. They're commonplace. They're so commonplace. This is ma'lumun min ad-din bid-darura. I mean, it doesn't take a scholar to figure this out. But this is common knowledge. They're expected. It's like, who doesn't do that? Who's not doing that? Hellfire safety is built into the law of Allah. I mean, we're inspected every single day by angels recording our deeds. One on the right and one on the left, serving as a reminder that we need to be up to code. Forget 65 stations, 65 fire stations in all of Camden County. Right now, there's probably over 600 angels with the number of people that we have here today. Is that not enough reminder to get up to code with hellfire safety? Back to Bilal. Perhaps this qantara is what it's called, the bridge, is why Bilal was so steadfast while burning under the baking sun on the scorching desert floor. He knew that the little bit of discomfort he had to face in this life was nothing in comparison to the torment that could be faced in the hereafter. He was busy thinking about hellfire safety. During his trials with Umayyah, he kept repeating, "My Lord is Allah, Al-Ahad, Al-Ahad." That's faith, number one. He was assigned to be the mu'adhin of the Prophet ﷺ. That's prayer, the second tool. He was appointed later in life to be the treasurer of the alms account, the zakat. That's 3. He fasted Ramadan and he even taught people the rulings of Ramadan, narrating a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Imam Ahmad in his collection said that he narrated the Prophet saying, the person that is cupped, meaning hijama, and the one that does it has broken their fast. That was from Bilal. He attended the pilgrimage, the farewell pilgrimage of the Prophet ﷺ. When the Prophet ﷺ stood up to address the people, he told Bilal, "Ansit li an-nas," have the people come and be quiet for me. And so Bilal stood up and called everyone to be quiet and listen before the Prophet gave his farewell sermon. That's Hajj and Umrah. What's next? The last, or I should say the 6th. Wudu, purification. And this is one of the special qualities of Bilal radiallahu anhu. It was reported that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam heard footsteps in front of him in paradise. He heard the sandals of someone in front of him in paradise. And he said, "Who is that?" And it was said, "That's Bilal. Bilal is in paradise." And so when the Prophet ﷺ went to approach Bilal, he said, "Listen, you need to tell me how you beat me to paradise. How did you beat me to paradise?" And so Bilal, he said to the Prophet ﷺ, He says that whenever I break my wudu, I go make wudu again. And whenever I make wudu, I feel like I owe Allah rak'atayn. I go make wudu, and then after I make wudu, I pray rak'atayn. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, that's exactly how you beat me to paradise. Bilal's footsteps were heard in Jannah by the Prophet ﷺ. If your footsteps could be heard, your footsteps in the hereafter, where would they be today? There's no judgment. حَسِبُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ قَبْلَ أَن تُحَاسَبُوا. Right? You take your own selves to account before the account actually comes to be. And you face the sirat al-qantara. Right? Where do you think your footsteps would be heard today if the Prophet ﷺ was listening? Are you steady enough to make it across the bridge and away from the fire? If you're not sure, take this lesson from Bilal and inspect your safety measures. How is your faith with Allah? Are you making your prayers? Are you caught up on your zakat payments? Do you have any days of Ramadan that need to be made up? And have you made Hajj or Umrah? Are you even intending to do so? Are you planning if you have not done so already? And how is your state of ritual purification? If those things are where they need to be, then that is your fire safety lesson for the day. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless us in this life and bless us in the next, and that He guide us to that which He loves and is pleased with. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.